They'll show you the pyramids, the temples, the hieroglyphs, but never the faces that built them. They'll tell you Egypt was the cradle of civilization, but they won't tell you whose cradle it was, because for over a century, the pharaohs of Egypt weren't from Greece or Rome or some mysterious Middle Eastern lineage they like to imply. They were black, real, unmistakably African kings who came from the south, from the rich kingdom of Kush, where the Nile still ran wild and gold shimmered beneath the sands. These were the Nubian pharaohs, the 25th dynasty, who rose when Egypt had fallen into chaos and restored it to its former greatness. They ruled with both might and wisdom, bringing back temples, order, and spiritual devotion. But history, written by those who could not bear to see black sovereignty, buried their legacy under layers of denial. They'll say Egypt influenced Africa, but the truth is the opposite. Civilization flowed up the Nile, not down. The Kushites were the keepers of the old ways, the heirs of the ancient black pharaohs, and when Egypt stumbled, they came not as conquerors, but as restorers. These African rulers were not strangers to Egypt. They were her children returning home. Yet somewhere along the line, that story was rewritten, whitewashed and sanitized, until even the statues had their noses broken, as if erasing the features could erase the truth. It's time to talk about the dynasty they don't want you to remember, the one where Africa reigned supreme, not in chains, not in servitude, but in power. The dynasty of kings, like Piye, Taharqa, and Shabaka, men whose skin was dark, whose culture was Kushite, and whose reign reshaped the destiny of the Nile. This was a time when the world's greatest empire bowed to African leadership, a time when art, architecture, and religion flourished again, under the guidance of men who remembered that Egypt was not a Western kingdom, it was an African legacy. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile during the 8th century BCE. Egypt was fractured, petty rulers fought over scraps of power, temples decayed, the once great monuments of Thebes stood in ruin. To the south, in the rising power of Nubia, a king named Piye watched all this unfold. He saw Egypt not as an enemy, but as a fallen ancestor. He was not content to sit idle while the legacy of his forefathers turned to dust. Piye gathered his forces, disciplined, devout, fierce, and marched north to restore the order of Maat, the sacred balance that guided every pharaoh before him. When Piye entered Egypt, he didn't burn it or pillage it, he purified it. He demanded that the Egyptian priests honor the gods again, that the people return to their ancient values. He conquered not through cruelty, but through conviction. And when he finally unified Egypt and Kush under one rule, he inscribed his victory on stone, not in boast, but in gratitude to the divine. "I am a king by birth," he wrote, "the son of a king, begotten by the god Amun." He didn't come from across the sea, he came from the source, from Africa itself. But in the centuries that followed, his dynasty was erased from the mainstream record. Western historians called them foreign usurpers, as if blackness was somehow foreign to Africa. Museums mislabeled their statues, textbooks skipped their reigns, and films turned them into lighter faces that fit the European fantasy. Even now, some scholars hesitate to say what's plainly visible on the walls of their tombs. These pharaohs were African men. Their art, their language, their rituals, their very blood was tied to the continent's deepest roots. The story of the Nubian pharaohs is more than a historical correction, it's a resurrection. It's proof that Egypt's greatness was not a gift from outsiders, but a reflection of African brilliance. For centuries, they've shown you Egypt's monuments as if they were mysterious relics built by ghosts. But those ghosts had names, faces, and skin that mirrored the people of the Nile Valley today. This is not about pride, it's about truth. The pyramids were not miracles of lost technology, they were the labor of African genius. And when you realize that, when you truly see Egypt for what it was, everything changes. You stop seeing Africa as a follower and start seeing it as the foundation. You stop believing that civilization came from Europe and understand that Europe's first teachers were Africans. The 25th dynasty didn't just rule Egypt, it reminded the world what Africa had always been capable of. That's the truth they buried under marble, textbooks, and museum glass. But today, we're digging it back up, because the day Africa reclaims its history is the day the world remembers its source. They'll show you the pyramids, but it's time you remember the faces that built them. Long before the Greeks set foot on Egyptian soil, or the Romans dreamed of empire, there was Kush, the kingdom that thrived in the shadow of the Nile's cataracts. To the north lay the glittering relics of Egypt's past, to the south, the rising pulse of African power. The people of Kush were no imitators, they were inheritors. They built pyramids of their own, smaller but steeper, clustered along the sands of Meroe, like a constellation of pride. Their kings and queens traced their lineage back to the same divine bloodlines that once ruled Egypt's golden age. And when Egypt's thrones turned weak, when its temples were looted, and its gods forgotten, the Kushites rose, not as conquerors, but as descendants reclaiming what was theirs. It's here that the story of the Black Pharaohs truly begins. In the city of Napata, the sacred heart of Kush, priests of Amun whispered prophecies of restoration. Amun, the hidden god, the source of creation, was not the god of conquerors, but of truth and balance. The Kushite rulers saw themselves as chosen to restore that balance, to bring back the harmony that Egypt had lost through greed and division. Among them was a man destined to become legend, King Piye. He was not only a warrior, but a philosopher king, a man who saw divinity in discipline. While northern Egypt's warlords squabbled over power, Piye prepared. He trained an army forged in heat and faith, men who could march for days under the burning sun. And when the signs were right, he began his campaign, not to destroy Egypt, but to awaken it. The armies of Piye moved like a wave up the Nile, not ravaging villages, but demanding loyalty to the gods of truth. When cities surrendered, Piye spared them. When kings bowed, he blessed them. His war was not one of blood, but of spirit. Yet make no mistake, he was a conqueror. At every stronghold he took, Piye erected monuments, carved inscriptions, and re-established the divine order. The weak fell before him, not because of superior weapons, but because he carried the authority of tradition, the aura of the Nile's ancient power, reborn in African form. And when he reached Memphis, the symbolic heart of Egypt, he prayed before its temples, and declared Egypt united once more, under the hand of Amun's chosen son. But the story doesn't end in triumph, it's only the beginning. Because after Piye's death, his successors would inherit not only his kingdom, but his mission, to prove to the world that Black Africa was the cradle of civilization, not its pupil. His brother Shabaka took the throne and continued the restoration. Shabaka was a visionary. He preserved ancient Egyptian texts, saving wisdom that might have been lost forever. He re-established the building of temples, reconstructed monuments, and revived art forms that had fallen silent for generations. He even had a copy of the ancient Memphite Theology, carved in stone, a philosophy that predated Greek thought by centuries. This was not a dark age, this was the rebirth of light, an African renaissance, long before Europe knew the word. Then came Taharqa, the most famous of the Nubian pharaohs. His reign was a blaze of glory that stretched from the Nile to the Mediterranean. He rebuilt temples at Karnak, expanded cities, and led armies that stood toe-to-toe with the might of Assyria. The Bible itself mentions Taharqa, calling him king of Ethiopia, the great African monarch who came to aid Jerusalem against invaders. He was a global figure, a pharaoh whose influence reached beyond Egypt into the heart of the ancient world. Even the prophets of Israel spoke his name with reverence. His presence was proof that Africa was not a shadow of other civilizations. It was a light that illuminated them. But history would twist this truth. Later chroniclers, uncomfortable with the sight of a black man crowned pharaoh, rebranded the Nubian dynasty as outsiders, foreign rulers who invaded Egypt. They ignored the shared language, the shared gods, the shared culture that bound Kush and Egypt for millennia. They painted these kings as anomalies, intrusions, when in reality, they were continuity itself. Africa preserving Africa. European historians couldn't accept that civilization didn't descend from Greece, but ascended from the Nile. And so, they rewrote the script. They replaced Nubian kings with pale marble statues. They redrew the faces. They redefined African until it meant anything but black. Even today, textbooks skim over the 25th dynasty like a footnote. Museums downplay their reigns, blending their features into ambiguity. Hollywood never dares to show a pharaoh who looks like the people of Sudan, of Ethiopia, of the Congo. But walk through the temples of Nubia, and the truth still stands in stone. Broad noses, full lips, dark skin, carved with pride. The art doesn't lie, the land doesn't lie. Only the history books do. What Piye, Shabaka, and Taharqa accomplished was more than political, it was spiritual. They restored not only Egypt's power, but its soul. And yet, centuries later, their descendants would watch the world forget them. Their monuments buried in sand, their names erased from lessons, their faces denied. But the Nile remembers, Africa remembers, and now, so do we. When Taharqa ruled, Egypt glowed once again under the light of prosperity. The temples thrummed with worship, the markets overflowed with grain and gold, and the Nile ran thick with ships bearing tribute from the farthest reaches of his dominion. He was not just a king, he was a symbol of resilience, unity, and divine right reclaimed. From the deserts of Nubia to the delta marshes of the north, his reign stitched together the broken lands of Egypt into one continuous thread of African pride. He commissioned new temples at Thebes, expanded the great temple complex at Karnak, and erected obelisks that pierced the heavens like spears of sunlight. His architects and artisans revived the old styles, melding them with Nubian artistry, bold lines, intricate carvings, faces proud and dark as the soil that sustained them. Under Taharqa, Egypt did not look to the Mediterranean for validation. It looked inward, to Africa, to the source of all creation. But empires rise not in isolation, and as Taharqa's Egypt prospered, new powers stirred beyond its borders. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire, disciplined, relentless and cruel, expanded like a storm cloud over the Levant. Their armies were machine-like, crushing city after city under iron discipline and psychological terror. They demanded tribute from every nation that wished to survive. When they looked south, they saw Egypt, rich, ancient, and in their eyes ripe for conquest. Taharqa, however, was no puppet. He refused to kneel. The Assyrians sent emissaries demanding submission, and Taharqa answered with silence, a defiance that would echo through history. When war came, it was not fought in whispers, it was fought in fire. The Assyrian armies clashed with the Nubian-led forces in battles recorded on both sides. One of the rare moments when Africa and Mesopotamia met in open conflict. Taharqa's soldiers were disciplined and fierce, their ranks filled with archers who could split a reed from across the river. They fought with valor, sometimes even triumphing against overwhelming odds. Yet the Assyrians' relentless war machines, their siege engines and iron weapons, gradually wore down the resistance. Cities fell, one by one, their walls shattered, their people scattered. Taharqa was forced to retreat south, back toward his ancestral lands, but even in defeat, he refused humiliation. The Assyrians could occupy the cities, but they could not conquer his spirit, nor the idea he represented, that Africa had once ruled the world's mightiest empire with justice and pride. And as the dust settled, the legacy of Taharqa began to take on mythic proportions. In the eyes of his people, he was not just a king who fought foreign invaders. He was a guardian of African sovereignty, a man who stood against the tide of empire and said, "No farther." His name lived on in stories, in songs, in the carvings left in stone long after Assyria's own power crumbled into dust. When the Assyrians fell, and later the Persians, and even the Greeks who followed them, Taharqa's memory remained like a buried ember, quiet but unextinguished. But how did the world forget him? How did the world forget all of them? Piye, Shabaka, Taharqa, the dynasty that scholars now call the 25th. The answer lies in centuries of erasure. The conquerors who came after, first the Persians, then Alexander's Greeks, then Rome, rewrote history in their own image. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers who claimed Egypt as theirs, recast themselves as the inheritors of pharaohs, but painted their statues with European features, chiseled their gods into unfamiliar forms, and slowly diluted the memory of Nubian rule. Later, when European historians rediscovered Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, they could not reconcile the evidence of African greatness with their racist ideologies. So they invented a lie. They called Nubia sub-Egyptian, its kings invaders. They claimed the civilization of the Nile came from somewhere else, from Asia, from Europe, from anywhere but Africa. The faces on temple walls, dark and proud, were dismissed as symbolic or stylized. The mummies with tightly curled hair, broad noses, and deep skin tones were labeled mixed. Every trace of African identity was scrubbed from the narrative, and yet, archaeology kept whispering the truth. The more we unearthed, the more impossible the lie became. The DNA of royal remains, the language on inscriptions, the cultural continuity between Nubia and Egypt, all of it points south, all of it points home. Today, the temples of Gebel Barkal still stand, carved into red stone beneath the desert sun. The pyramids of Nuri and Meroe pierce the horizon, smaller but no less magnificent than Giza's, built by the same descendants who refused to let the art of pyramid building die. When the wind blows through them, you can almost hear the chants of Amun's priests, the sound of drums, the hum of a kingdom that refused to vanish. And still, in the museums of London and Paris, fragments of their legacy sit mislabeled, a head without a name, a statue called unidentified ruler, a face that looks unmistakably African, but described in cautious academic language. It's not because the evidence is unclear, it's because the truth is uncomfortable. Yet that truth is breaking through now, piece by piece. Modern scholars, many of them African themselves, are restoring the story that was taken. The world is finally beginning to understand that Egypt's greatness was never stolen. It was shared, passed down through the veins of a continent that gave birth to civilization. The Nubian pharaohs were not anomalies. They were reminders of what was always there. Black kings ruled Egypt not by accident, but by birthright. Their blood runs in the Nile, their names in the wind, their faces in the stone. As the memory of Taharqa's defiance faded beneath the sands of time, his lineage and his people carried on the pulse of his vision. South of Egypt, in the heart of Kush, the Nubian cities of Napata and later Meroe became sanctuaries of continuity, places where the ancient gods of the Nile were still worshipped long after foreign tongues echoed through Egypt's temples. There, queens and kings preserved the old rituals, the hieroglyphic scripts, and the divine bloodline that traced back to the earliest dynasties. The so-called Black Pharaohs were not gone, they had simply gone home, carrying Egypt's sacred flame back into the cradle that first lit it. Their pyramids still rise in rows across the Nubian desert, slender, sharp-angled, distinctly African. The people of Meroe built them not as copies of Giza, but as evolutions of them, innovations that belonged fully to Kushite culture. Within them lie kings and queens wrapped not just in linen, but in legacy. It's a cruel irony that for centuries, Europeans studied these pyramids and refused to believe what they saw. Early explorers, standing before the royal tombs of Nubia, claimed they must have been inspired by foreigners, unable to accept that Africans built them. They measured the angles, drew sketches, marveled at the architecture, and then erased the builders with a sentence. But archaeology doesn't lie. Beneath the sands, excavations revealed inscriptions written in Meroitic script, an indigenous African language still only partially decoded. Reliefs showed monarchs with tightly coiled hair, dark skin, full lips, unmistakable African features. The truth was right there, carved in stone, yet ignored, because it contradicted the colonizers' comfort. By the time Rome came to dominate Egypt, the memory of these kings was already fading in official narratives. To the Romans, Africa was a frontier to exploit, not a source of civilization. Their chroniclers wrote of Egypt as a curiosity, ancient, mysterious, but firmly theirs now. They built new temples, renamed cities, and rebranded Egypt's gods to fit their pantheon. But south of the border, in Kush, the embers of the old power still glowed. Queens like Amon-Arenas and Amon-Ishiketo carried forward the same royal bloodline as Taharqa and Piye. They traded with the Mediterranean, built monumental structures, and even warred with Rome itself. And just as their ancestors had faced Assyria, they met empire with defiance. Amon-Arenas, the Kandake, queen, general, and diplomat, was the living echo of that defiance. When Augustus, Rome's self-proclaimed divine emperor, sent his legions into Nubia to extend his dominion, Amon-Arenas led her armies against them. Her soldiers ambushed Roman outposts, burned their forts, and captured their standards, the sacred symbols of Roman pride. When Rome retaliated, she did not cower behind walls. She met them in open battle, losing an eye, but not her will. And when Augustus eventually sued for peace, it was not as conqueror to subject, but as equal to equal. The treaty they signed guaranteed Nubia's independence for generations. In every sense, Amon-Arenas was Taharqa reborn, proof that the spirit of the Black Pharaohs could not be erased, only transformed. Yet Western history books treat her, and all who came before her, as footnotes. They dedicate chapters to Caesar's campaigns, to Alexander's conquests, to Napoleon's fantasies of empire, but only lines if that, to the Nubians, who ruled the land those conquerors coveted. Even the very art of ancient Egypt was distorted to support a colonial fantasy. Statues with broad noses and full lips were smashed, their features refined by the chisel to look more European. When 19th century museums displayed mummies, they bleached their portraits in printed reproductions. Egypt was cast as an Eastern civilization, never an African one. The Nile was painted as a border between continents, rather than a bridge between peoples. But the river's current flows one way, and it flows from south to north. Civilization, too, flowed from Africa upward. Modern science now backs what Nubians always knew. Studies of DNA extracted from ancient remains reveal deep genetic connections between Egyptians and populations from Sudan and Central Africa. Linguistic evidence links early Egyptian with languages still spoken today across the Sahel and the Horn. The cultural practices, scarification patterns, burial rites, divine kingship, all bear distinctly African roots. The 25th dynasty wasn't an interruption in Egyptian history, it was its restoration. These rulers returned Egypt to its spiritual and cultural foundation, cleansing it of corruption and reuniting it with its source. In their reign, Egypt looked less toward the Mediterranean and more toward the heart of Africa, as it had in the beginning. If you walk today through the ruins of Meroe, you can still feel that pulse. The sun bakes the stone the same way it did 2,700 years ago. The carvings of rams, the symbol of a moon, remain sharp despite millennia of wind. Tourists seldom come here. The world still forgets what it doesn't want to remember, but for those who do, the sight is unforgettable. Lines of pyramids stretch across the horizon like notes in a song written in sand and time. You can almost hear the drums of coronation, the chants in the temples, the whisper of ancient queens as they anoint their heirs. The pyramids of Meroe are not ruins of conquest, they are monuments of return. The return of power to the people who first shaped it. And perhaps that is why their story still provokes resistance. To accept that the pharaohs were African, that Egypt's glory is part of Black history, forces a reckoning with centuries of lies. It means rewriting textbooks, reimagining icons, and recognizing that the roots of civilization were never pale or foreign.
They were homegrown, nurtured in African soil. It means that every child of the continent, every descendant of its diaspora, carries within them the same inheritance of brilliance and sovereignty that Piye, Shabaka, and Taharqa once did. That truth, long buried beneath marble and myth, is rising again, just like the sun over Nubia.
By the time the memory of the Nubian pharaohs faded from Egypt's temples, the world had already begun rewriting their story. European explorers who stumbled upon their remains in the 19th century didn't see kings, they saw anomalies. They looked at Taharqa's statues, at Piye's pyramids, at the murals depicting dark-skinned rulers crowned with the double uraeus of Egypt and Kush, and they couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. In their worldview, Africa was the dark continent, a land without history or civilization, so the evidence had to be wrong. The inscriptions must have been misread. The sculptures must have been damaged, their features exaggerated by erosion, but the truth was too clear, too deeply etched in stone to erase completely. The faces of the black pharaohs stared back through time with quiet authority, reminding the world that history is not what is written, it's what survives. The 25th dynasty's reign didn't just change Egypt, it rippled across the ancient world. Under Piye and Taharqa, Egypt reconnected with its southern roots and reclaimed its place as a major power. They rebuilt temples that had fallen into ruin, restored sacred rituals, and re-established balance between the gods of Upper and Lower Egypt. The Nile Valley thrived again under their leadership, and for a brief, shining century, Africa once more held the world's most advanced civilization firmly in its hands. These were not invaders or usurpers. They were descendants of the same ancient people who had given rise to Egypt's earliest dynasties thousands of years earlier. The Nile was their family tree, and every bend of its river carried the memory of their ancestors. But when Western scholars later mapped history, they sliced that family tree in half. Egypt, they said, belonged to the Near East, Nubia to sub-Saharan Africa. The line between them wasn't geographic, it was racial. By redrawing that border, colonial academia could celebrate Egyptian achievements without crediting African people. Egypt became a miraculous exception, a civilized oasis surrounded by supposed barbarism, and the Nubian pharaohs, they were quietly removed from the timeline, reduced to a brief Kushite interlude, a footnote before Assyria's invasion. But in truth, the Assyrians themselves wrote of Taharqa as a king of great power, a formidable opponent, whose armies could not be easily broken. His name appears in both the Hebrew Bible and the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia. To the ancient world, Taharqa was a titan. To modern history books, he became a ghost. What made their reign so powerful wasn't just politics, it was philosophy. The Nubian kings ruled with a reverence for Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic balance, truth, and justice. Where later dynasties had ruled through decadence and division, the Kushites saw themselves as restorers of divine order. Their inscriptions are filled with devotion, not to gold or conquest, but to righteousness. Piye's victory stela, discovered at Jebel Barkal, records not just his conquests, but his moral code. He wrote, "I am a king by birth. A god has made me strong." His campaigns were not framed as wars of greed, but of purification, cleansing Egypt of corruption, and returning the temples to the gods. He saw himself as a shepherd, not a tyrant, guiding the people back to harmony. These ideals didn't die with the fall of their dynasty. They flowed south into Nubia, into Meroe, and beyond. Centuries later, Greek philosophers would marvel at the wisdom of Egypt, never realizing how much of it was preserved by the Kushites. Even when Egypt fell under Persian, Greek and Roman rule, the intellectual flame that had been rekindled by the Black Pharaohs burned quietly in the background. You can trace its echoes in the libraries of Alexandria, in the architectural symmetry of the Parthenon, in the very concept of enlightened kingship that shaped Europe's monarchies. Yet the irony is bitter. the very civilizations that learned from Africa turned around and erased Africa from the story. When French and British colonial powers invaded Sudan in the 1800s, they came face to face with the monuments of Nubia. Pyramids, smaller but sharper than those at Giza, temple walls carved with hieroglyphs, reliefs of queens wielding swords and crowns. It didn't fit their narrative, so they labeled it mysterious, a word Europeans used when the truth made them uncomfortable. Excavations were done not to honor history, but to claim it. Artifacts were taken to museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. Meroitic inscriptions were studied but rarely publicized. The African faces carved in granite were hidden in basements or misidentified as foreign rulers. By the time the Western public learned about ancient Egypt, it had already been bleached of its color, its geography shifted northward, and its identity stolen. And yet, even under centuries of distortion, the spirit of those African pharaohs refused to vanish. Every few decades, a discovery would surface, an inscription, a statue, a royal tomb that forced the world to confront what it had ignored. Archaeologists, like George Reisner, though himself a man of his time, uncovered burial sites at El Kuru and Nuri that left no doubt of Nubia's royal legacy. The remains were distinctly African, adorned with regalia, indistinguishable from Egyptian kings. The line between Egypt and Nubia blurred once more, as it always had in reality. Modern historians now recognize that the Kushite Renaissance was one of the most important cultural revivals in ancient Africa. The Nubian pharaohs preserved Egyptian art, theology, and architecture during an era of decay, ensuring that the memory of the Old Kingdom survived long enough to inspire the future. Without them, much of what we know as classical Egypt might have been lost forever. They weren't conquerors or imitators. They were custodians of a shared heritage, protectors of a civilization that was always African at its core. Today, scholars in Sudan and Egypt are reclaiming that legacy. The pyramids of Meroe are being restored. Nubian descendants are writing their own history, not as footnotes, but as authors. And the world is slowly beginning to acknowledge what should have been obvious all along, that the hands that raised the temples of Karnak, that carved the statues of the gods, and that built the pyramids were hands of Africa. The Nile did not divide the continent, it connected it. When Piye's successors inherited the double crown of Egypt and Nubia, the world around them was shifting. Empires rose and fell like the tides of the Nile, each leaving scars on the land and stories on the stone. But none matched the divine certainty with which the Nubian pharaohs carried their purpose. Taharqa, the most celebrated among them, stood as the embodiment of African kingship, tall, broad-shouldered, adorned in gold that glimmered like sunlight on river water. To his people, he was the living Horus, the protector of Egypt's soul. To the outside world, he was both a mystery and a threat. Even the Bible mentions him by name, describing the king of Kush who came to aid Jerusalem against the Assyrian armies. His reputation stretched from the deserts of Sudan to the mountains of Judea, whispered by traders, priests, and poets alike. He was Africa's lion in a world of jackals, unflinching and unmatched. Under Taharqa's rule, Egypt and Kush thrived in a renaissance of art, science, and faith. Temples rose from sandstone and limestone along the Nile, each dedicated to gods older than time. The Temple of Amun at Kawa was one such jewel, an architectural hymn to the unity between Egypt and Nubia. In its carvings, Taharqa's shone making offerings to the gods, his face serene yet strong, his features unmistakably African. It was not just a monument to faith, but to identity, a declaration that black kings ruled by divine right. These temples weren't symbols of oppression or tyranny. They were centers of learning, of healing, of connection to the divine. Priests taught astronomy and medicine. Artisans crafted jewelry and sculpture with precision that would astonish modern engineers. In that golden age, Egypt was not merely a kingdom, It was an idea, a living bridge between heaven and earth, carried forward by Nubian hands. But as with all great dynasties, envy and ambition gathered like storm clouds beyond the horizon. The Assyrians, hungry for conquest and dominance, turned their gaze toward the fertile Nile. They had heard of the riches of Egypt, its gold, its temples, its glory. They saw Taharqa not as a divine ruler, but as an obstacle to expansion. And so, the world's two greatest powers collided, the disciplined armies of Assyria, clad in bronze and iron, against the desert-born warriors of Africa. For years they clashed across the sands and rivers, the sound of war drums echoing through the valleys. Taharqa's strategies were brilliant. He used the terrain as a weapon, ambushing invaders where they least expected, striking swiftly then vanishing into the dunes. To the Assyrians, it must have felt as if they were fighting shadows. Despite his brilliance, even a lion can be worn down by relentless assault. The Assyrians eventually captured Memphis, forcing Taharqa to retreat to Thebes and later back into Nubia. But even in retreat, he did not surrender his crown. He did not bow to foreign gods or sign away his land. Instead, he focused his strength on building a legacy that would outlast any empire. In Nubia, he constructed the pyramids of Nuri, their sharp angles cutting into the sky like declarations of defiance. Beneath those stones, he ensured that future generations would remember who they were: Africans, kings, creators of civilization. To this day, those pyramids stand in silence, their weathered sides whispering of a time when black power ruled the world. When Taharqa passed, his nephew Tanudamani took up the mantle. The Assyrians thought the dynasty was broken, but Tanudamani struck back, driving them from Thebes and reclaiming parts of Egypt, if only for a moment. His reign was brief, but his fire was pure, the last flicker of the Kushite flame before it receded back into Nubia. But though the dynasty's time in Egypt ended, its influence never did. In Nubia, the kingdom of Kush continued to flourish for nearly 1,000 years more, giving birth to new cities, new queens, and new philosophies that would ripple through time. Meroe rose as a capital of iron and intellect, a place where women ruled as Kandak, warrior queens, who commanded armies and governed with divine authority. It was as if the spirit of the 25th dynasty had moved south, evolving into something even freer, even more African. Meanwhile, the memory of the Nubian pharaohs became myth in the north. The Greeks who later conquered Egypt marveled at its temples and science, but took credit for its wisdom. The Romans followed, chiseling their faces over African gods and calling it progress. Over centuries, the black origin of Egyptian greatness faded into whispers. Western scholars reimagined the pharaohs as pale-skinned nobles, reshaping statues, repainting murals, and redrawing maps to align with their own reflection. Even when evidence screamed otherwise, lips, noses, hair, pigments, inscriptions, they explained it away. They said the stone had darkened over time, that artists exaggerated, that Africa couldn't possibly have produced such brilliance. And yet, the hieroglyphs tell a different story, one that no revision can fully erase. The rulers who called themselves sons of Ra came from the south. The heart of Egypt was always African. Today, as the sands continue to reveal their secrets, every new discovery forces the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. The DNA of ancient mummies shows clear sub-Saharan links. The art of the period mirrors the cultures of Nubia, not Europe or the Middle East. The temples at Kawa and Gebel Barkal remain standing, carved with African faces, preserved by African sun. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes. Africa did not borrow from Egypt. Egypt was Africa. The Nubian pharaohs were not an exception. They were a continuation, a living thread, connecting the earliest dynasties to the roots of the continent itself. And perhaps that's why history tried so hard to bury them, because the sight of Africa in full glory, creating,
leading, and civilizing, is too powerful a truth to ignore.
When we speak of Africa's glory, we often begin and end with Egypt. But Egypt itself is a chapter written in the ink of Nubian genius. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty weren't outsiders stealing thrones. They were the children of the same Nile that had nourished Egypt for thousands of years. The river didn't stop at Aswan. It kept flowing south, carrying culture, language, and divinity through the heart of Nubia. There, in the lands of Kush, the ancestors had watched Egypt rise, fall, and rise again. They saw when the northern kingdoms fractured, when temples were neglected, when the gods' names were forgotten. So when they came to power, they didn't conquer. They restored. They believed Egypt had drifted too far from Ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance, justice, and truth, and it was their sacred duty to bring it back. That's what Piye and Taharqa were doing, not waging war for glory, but reviving a wounded civilization. To understand their motivation, we must step into their worldview. The Kushites didn't see themselves as separate from Egypt. They saw themselves as its rightful heirs. In their temples, the same gods reigned: Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis. The same sacred rituals continued. The same belief that kings ruled by divine mandate. Their version of kingship, however, was more spiritual, more grounded in humility and devotion. Where later Egyptian dynasties built monuments to ego, the Nubians built monuments to faith. Their temples were places of communion between ruler and god, nation and nature. At Jebel Barkal, the holy mountain, rising from the desert like the crown of the earth, the Kushites believed the god Amun himself resided. There they received visions, guidance, and legitimacy. Every coronation began beneath its shadow, binding the ruler's destiny to the will of the divine. The pharaoh was not merely king. He was chosen, a vessel for Ma'at, accountable to both heaven and history. When you look at the art of this era, the difference is striking. In the reliefs and statues of Taharqa, his features are unmistakably African. Broad nose, full lips, tight curls, sculpted with precision and pride. There is no attempt to hide or soften the truth of his identity. His image was not designed for approval from foreign eyes. It was a reflection of his people. The artists carved the truth into stone. Egypt's kings were black, and not just in appearance, but in worldview, in heritage, in cultural DNA. These weren't invaders, bringing something new. They were restorers bringing something home. The Nubian pharaohs also brought discipline and morality back to Egypt's leadership. Where greed and corruption had spread under previous rulers, they reinstated ethical governance rooted in Ma'at. They funded temples, restructured taxation, revived education, and restored diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. Their Egypt became a beacon of order once more, admired even by its enemies. Greek historians, despite their biases, could not deny that under these rulers, the temples flourished and the Nile flowed with prosperity. But in Europe's later retellings, this chapter became inconvenient, a story that shattered the illusion of African inferiority, so they simply skipped it. The textbooks you grew up with may mention the 25th dynasty in passing, but they won't show you its faces, won't tell you that it was Africa's hand that steadied Egypt when it faltered. If you've ever wondered why the features on some ancient statues are chipped away, especially the noses, here's a truth that many historians whisper, but few dare to shout. It was deliberate. When conquerors came, first Assyrians, then Persians, then Greeks, then Romans, they destroyed what didn't fit their vision. The statues that bore African features were defaced to erase the proof of black rule. They didn't want future generations to look upon those kings and see themselves, because to acknowledge that the world's first great civilization was built, ruled, and revived by Africans would mean rewriting everything Europe told itself about superiority. That's why Taharqa's temples were buried under sand, why Nubia's pyramids were left to crumble, why the story of Piye and Shabaka was buried beneath Latin and Greek lies, but the earth has a way of remembering. When archaeologists began excavating Napata and Meroe in the 19th and 20th centuries, what they found didn't match the European imagination. They expected savagery, primitiveness. Instead, they found precision architecture, advanced metallurgy, written language, and art equal to anything in Egypt. They found pyramids, dozens of them, built by Nubian kings, long after Egypt's own pyramid age had ended. They found queens buried with gold and regalia, hieroglyphs etched with pride, and suddenly, the narrative cracked. Because how do you explain African barbarians building monuments identical to those of civilized Egypt? You can't, unless you admit the truth, that Egypt's brilliance was never separate from Africa's. It was Africa. Even now, as Western institutions continue to display these artifacts in museums far from their homeland, the question remains, why is the blackness of Egypt still a debate? Why do scholars hesitate to use the word African when describing people who lived and died on African soil, who wrote in African tongues, who worshipped African gods? The answer is the same as it's always been: control. Control of narrative, of image, of pride. Because if the world truly acknowledged the full African identity of Egypt, it would shatter centuries of colonial mythology. The idea that Africa contributed nothing to civilization would dissolve overnight, and with it, so would the psychological chains that keep people from seeing their own greatness. That's why stories like this matter, because when you reclaim history, you reclaim yourself, and when you reclaim yourself, you become unstoppable. The story of the African pharaohs doesn't end with their rise, it deepens with their resistance, because as the 25th dynasty flourished, enemies gathered at Egypt's borders, determined to crush what they couldn't comprehend. The Assyrians to the northeast saw Nubia's power as an affront, a reversal of the order they believed the world should have, a black dynasty ruling the land of the pharaohs. To them, it was blasphemy against empire. So they came with armies of iron and arrogance, convinced they could march through the desert and erase the legacy of Kush. But the Nubians didn't fall easily. Under Taharqa's command, Egypt and Nubia stood as one, not divided by skin or border, but united by the Nile and the gods. Taharqa's reign was one of both prayer and power. He built temples across the land, not as monuments of vanity, but as symbols of endurance, of faith that Ma'at would prevail, even when steel clashed with stone. When the Assyrians invaded, they expected chaos. Instead, they met strategy. Taharqa wasn't some naive ruler playing at war. He had studied Egypt's ancient defenses, learned the art of reading terrain and tide. He used the desert to his advantage, striking at supply lines, forcing the enemy to fight where the sun itself became his ally. The Assyrian chronicles, written by his enemies, even admit that Taharqa was a formidable opponent, one who led his forces personally, his chariot cutting across the battlefield like a blade through sand. Though the Assyrians eventually pushed him south, they never broke his spirit. To retreat wasn't defeat, it was preservation. He refused to let Egypt become a puppet. When he returned to Kush, he continued to rule, continued to build, continued to pray. His kingdom endured long after Assyria crumbled to dust. That endurance is the mark of the Nubian legacy, not just to conquer, but to last. After Taharqa came Tanuta, the last of the 25th dynasty, another son of Kush, who refused to bow. When the Assyrians tried again to impose control, Tanuta reclaimed Thebes, restored Egyptian temples, and proclaimed that Ma'at would rise again. His inscriptions are among the most powerful pieces of writing in ancient history. He spoke of the gods guiding him, of truth prevailing over chaos, of his mission to bring harmony back to the two lands. Even as foreign armies advanced, he never surrendered his vision of unity. He saw himself as part of something eternal, not a man fighting for territory, but a king fighting for the soul of civilization. And though he was eventually forced back to Napata, his defiance echoed through generations. Egypt may have changed rulers, but the heart of its power had already shifted south, to Nubia, to Kush, to the black kings who kept its flame alive. That's the part the textbooks never tell you, that when Egypt's empire faded, it didn't disappear. It transformed. The spirit of the pharaohs continued in Nubia's later kingdoms, Napata, then Meroe. These cities became the new centers of learning and trade, where iron replaced bronze, and hieroglyphs evolved into the unique Meroitic script, Africa's first written language beyond Egypt. It's here that the legacy of the 25th dynasty took its next form, a civilization built on self-sufficiency, innovation, and pride. The queens of Meroe, known as Kandakes, ruled with the same authority as the pharaohs. They commanded armies, signed treaties, and were worshipped as living goddesses. They were the daughters of the Nubian pharaohs, continuing a lineage that stretched from Piye to Amenerenas, the same queen who would later defeat Rome itself. This was the afterlife of Egypt's greatness, not buried in sand, but reborn in the heart of Africa. When Europeans first stumbled upon Meroe's ruins, they couldn't believe what they saw. Dozens of pyramids, smaller than Giza's, but just as precise, carved from the same golden stone, walls etched with hieroglyphs, temples to Amun and Isis, still standing proud against the desert wind. These were not the remnants of some lost civilization. They were evidence of a continuum, proof that African greatness didn't begin and end with Egypt's northern dynasties, but lived on through Nubia's kings and queens. Yet the Western scholars who documented these discoveries found ways to minimize them. They called the Nubians imitators, as if brilliance could only be borrowed. But the truth is the opposite. Nubia wasn't copying Egypt, it was continuing it. The same way Rome borrowed from Greece, Kush inherited Egypt's essence and made it its own. Africanized, rebalanced, purified. And here's where the irony burns brightest. While Europe was still crawling through its own dark ages, Nubia was thriving. Its cities traded with Arabia, India, and even China. Its blacksmiths forged weapons that rivaled anything in the Mediterranean. Its queens ruled with a power and dignity the world hadn't seen since Cleopatra's time. But because those rulers were undeniably African, the story was deemed inconvenient. Better to let Egypt's grandeur stand alone, severed from its roots, than admit that Africa held empires within empires. Better to fill museums with statues, stripped of their noses, than to let those statues speak for themselves. The 25th dynasty wasn't an interruption. It was a reminder that Africa has always been the heart of civilization, the source from which knowledge, art, and power flow. The kings of Kush didn't just rule Egypt, they defined what it meant to rule with purpose, and every time their names are spoken, Piye, Shabaka, Taharqa, Tanu Tamani, they reclaim a little of what was taken. Because history isn't just written in books, it's carved into the stones that refuse to crumble. And those stones, still standing in the Nubian desert, tell a story Europe tried to silence, but never could. That Africa never needed permission to be great.
As the centuries passed, the echoes of the Nubian pharaohs faded from Egypt's monuments, but not from its memory. The priests who once worshipped Amun and Thebes carried their faith south to the temples of Napata and Meroe, ensuring that the divine connection between Egypt and Nubia never died. Travelers and traders who moved along the Nile spoke of a land where kings and queens still ruled beneath the sun, where pyramids rose again from red earth, and where the gods of the north found new homes in the south. And though foreign powers, from Persia to Greece to Rome, would come to claim Egypt's crown, none could claim its soul. That soul had already migrated, flowing back to its African source, where it would burn for another 1,000 years. When the Greeks arrived, they were mesmerized. Herodotus himself wrote of black-skinned peoples with curly hair who lived beyond Egypt, whose customs were ancient and whose kingdoms were rich. The Greeks admired Egypt, but they feared Nubia, for while Egypt was conquered, Nubia was unconquered, fierce and proud. And when Alexander's generals divided his empire, one of them, Ptolemy, took Egypt and began the Ptolemaic dynasty. a Greek reign that sought to erase the Nubian legacy once and for all. They built marble temples where sandstone once stood and carved their faces onto the gods. Yet even they couldn't hide the truth, because the blood of the pharaohs still ran in the land itself. In Nubia, Meroe became the beating heart of African civilization. Its people mastered ironworking, creating weapons and tools that fueled a new era of prosperity. The land was rich in gold and cattle, and its traders reached as far as India and the Mediterranean. The Meroitic script, still not fully deciphered today, was a language of power and poetry, a symbol of independence from Egypt's shadow. The rulers of Meroe, both men and women, were depicted with unmistakably African features: deep brown skin, broad noses, tightly coiled hair. They wore crowns that mixed the styles of Upper Egypt and Kush, blending tradition with innovation. This was not imitation, it was evolution. The African pharaohs had laid the foundation for a civilization that would endure long after their northern counterparts were gone. Among these rulers were the Kendeks, the warrior queens who would later inspire legends across continents. One of them, Amanirenas, would become a symbol of resistance so fierce that even Rome had to acknowledge her. When Augustus tried to expand the Roman Empire into Nubia, Amanirenas led her armies north to meet them. The clash was brutal, but it was she who returned with spoils. Among them, the bronze head of Augustus himself, which she buried beneath a temple threshold so her people could trample the face of empire for generations. This act wasn't just defiance, it was reclamation. The spirit of the 25th dynasty lived through her, through every Kendek who ruled without apology. The African pharaohs had passed their torch, and their daughters carried it into eternity. But while Nubia thrived, Egypt itself became a pawn in the games of foreign kings. First the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, all claimed ownership over a land whose identity they could never truly understand. They marveled at its temples, its knowledge, its precision, but they refused to acknowledge the African hands that created it. Statues were recarved, names were replaced, and faces were lightened in stone. Over time, the true complexion of Egypt's greatness was bleached out of its own history. This was no accident. It was propaganda. To control the narrative of civilization, Europe had to separate Egypt from Africa, as if geography itself could be rewritten. But no matter how they rewrote the maps, the Nile still flowed south, and along its banks, the descendants of the Nubian pharaohs still prayed, still ruled, still remembered. When modern archaeologists finally reached the ruins of Napata and Meroe in the 19th century, they were stunned. Dozens of pyramids dotted the horizon, their sharp angles catching the desert light. Hieroglyphs covered the walls, not crude imitations, but inscriptions of royalty and divinity. Burial chambers filled with gold, iron, and amulets spoke of a people who revered their dead as gods. Yet the scholars who studied them hesitated. The faces in the carvings didn't fit the narrative. The features were unmistakably African, broad, strong, regal. The conclusion was undeniable, but their words were careful. They called them dark-skinned Egyptians, or Sudanese rulers, avoiding the word that broke their illusion: black. Even when evidence screamed it, the world wasn't ready to admit that Africa's fingerprints were all over the story of civilization. Today, those same ruins stand as silent witnesses to the truth. The pyramids of Meroe may be smaller than those at Giza, but their precision is unmatched. They stand in perfect alignment with the stars, just like their northern ancestors. Inside, the murals depict pharaohs wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol of unity that transcended borders. In every line of stone, you can see the continuation of Egypt's soul, preserved by its African children. The 25th dynasty and its descendants weren't erased. They were simply hidden beneath layers of denial and distortion. But history has a way of resurfacing, and now, the truth is emerging from the sands once again. To understand the African pharaohs is to understand that Egypt's glory was never an isolated miracle. It was part of a greater African continuum, one of art, science, faith, and resilience. The Nile wasn't a border, it was a bridge, carrying ideas, language, and blood from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean world. The Nubians didn't invade Egypt, they reclaimed their inheritance. They ruled not as foreigners, but as sons and daughters returning home. And when the world finally acknowledges that truth, the story of civilization itself will have to be rewritten. Because Egypt was not an exception, it was proof. Proof that Africa has always been the beginning, the teacher, the cradle of human brilliance. By the time the last Nubian pharaoh's crown was laid to rest, Egypt had entered an age of silence, a time when invaders ruled in the name of the pharaohs, but the heart that once beat beneath the black granite had dimmed. The world moved on, rewriting the script so thoroughly that by the time the European scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries began their expeditions, the African origins of Egypt had been systematically scrubbed away. They called it rediscovery, as if Egypt had vanished, when in truth, it had simply been ignored. These explorers arrived with brushes and chisels, pretending to seek truth, but carrying the biases of empire. They marveled at the temples of Luxor, the pyramids of Giza, the statues of Ramses II, but when the faces they uncovered looked too African, they turned their gaze elsewhere. If the evidence didn't fit the myth of white civilization's supremacy, they simply buried it again, beneath new words and new theories. Egypt became the crown jewel of archaeology, but its true people became invisible. Victorian scholars insisted that the ancient Egyptians were somehow Caucasian, despite the fact that every line of genetic, cultural, and geographical evidence pointed south. They divided Africa from Egypt with academic precision, inventing racial categories to preserve their illusions. They said civilization flowed northward, as if the Nile itself defied gravity, and in the process, they robbed an entire continent of its legacy. Museums filled up with looted artifacts, masks, coffins, papyri, statues, all labeled as Near Eastern or Mediterranean, never African. It wasn't just theft of gold and stone, it was theft of identity. The African pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, the Nubian kings who had revived Egypt's greatness, were reduced to footnotes or dismissed as foreign occupiers. Yet these were the same rulers who restored temples, revived art, and re-established order after centuries of chaos. They were Egypt's healers, and still, their names Piye, Shabaka, Taharqa, were spoken only in academic circles, detached from the people they once ruled. Taharqa, in particular, deserves to stand beside Ramses and Tutankhamun in the pantheon of greatness. His reign saw massive building projects, stretching from Thebes to Napata, temples dedicated to Amun, palaces lined with gold and ivory. Even the Bible mentions him, Taharqa, king of Kush, the powerful ally who stood against Assyria. This was not legend, this was global history. The armies of Kush under Taharqa were feared and respected across continents, a reminder that the might of Africa was not confined to its borders. Yet when Egyptologists reconstructed their timelines, they treated his dynasty as an interruption, a side story in the grand European narrative. How convenient that the one dynasty that unified the black lands of Africa was rewritten as an anomaly. Even in art, the distortion continued. When painters and sculptors recreated the image of the pharaohs for museums and textbooks, they lightened the skin, narrowed the noses, and straightened the hair. Cleopatra became a white woman in marble. Tutankhamun's face was remade for Western aesthetics. They turned Africa's rulers into Europeans wearing Egyptian costumes. Hollywood would later finish the job, casting blonde and blue-eyed actors as the descendants of the Nile, cementing the illusion in global imagination. But truth has a habit of whispering through cracks. Modern DNA studies have shown undeniable links between ancient Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. Linguistic and cultural evidence points the same way. From Nubian-style crowns to the shared deities of Amun, Isis, and Osiris, the fingerprints of Africa are everywhere in Egyptian civilization. As the 20th century unfolded, African scholars began to reclaim what was stolen. Thinkers like Cheikh Anta Diop, Théophile Obenga, and John Henrik Clarke
tore down the colonial veil that had blinded the world. They argued, with evidence and conviction, that Egypt was not a European miracle, it was an African achievement. Diop's research into melanin content in mummies, linguistic connections between Egyptian and other African languages, and cultural parallels between Nile Valley and West African societies became impossible to ignore. Yet mainstream academia resisted, fearing that admitting Egypt's blackness would rewrite the entire hierarchy of world history. Because if Africa was the cradle of civilization, not just biologically, but intellectually, then the foundations of Western superiority would crumble. The conversation shifted again in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as new technology entered the field. CT scans, DNA analysis, and forensic reconstructions began revealing what the old archaeologists refused to see. The faces were brown, the features unmistakably African. Tomb murals, once dismissed as symbolic, turned out to be literal depictions of real people, dark-skinned farmers, artisans, soldiers, and nobles. Even the hair found on royal mummies showed African texture, tightly curled and full of life. Yet despite this mountain of evidence, the debate continues, as if the truth itself is too heavy for the world to carry. Today, when you stand before the colossal statues at Abu Simbel or the temples of Karnak, you're not looking at the work of anonymous ancients. You're standing before the legacy of black rulers, of men and women who carried the sun in their skin and the Nile in their blood. Their civilization didn't just shape Egypt, it shaped humanity. They charted the stars, mapped time, engineered monuments that still defy logic, and forged a spiritual system that influenced three of the world's major religions. To say they were anything less than African is to erase the story of human brilliance itself. The African pharaohs of Egypt were more than rulers. They were reminders of what Africa has always been capable of. They stood at the crossroads of worlds, uniting the desert and the river, the past and the future. Their reigns proved that civilization is not a gift bestowed by conquest, but a seed born of balance, faith, and knowledge. And though centuries of rewriting tried to obscure their faces, they endure. Every grain of sand in the Valley of the Kings still hums their memory. Every scarab, every hieroglyph, every tomb whispers the same truth. Egypt was African, and the pharaohs who restored it to glory wore the crown of Kush, the crown of black kings and queens who refused to be forgotten.
As centuries passed, and the desert winds swept over the tombs of the Nile, the world forgot the names that once commanded both reverence and fear. The 25th dynasty became a faint echo in textbooks, a curiosity tucked between the better-known tales of Ramses and Cleopatra. But what the world forgot, the earth did not. Beneath layers of sand and silence, the legacy of the Nubian pharaohs waited for rediscovery. It began not in London or Paris, but in the golden valleys of Sudan, the ancient land of Kush, cradle of the kings who would one day rule Egypt. Here, in Napata and Meroe, archaeologists began to uncover pyramids that mirrored those of Giza, but carried a distinct African signature: sharper angles, smaller bases, symbols of a dynasty born in the heart of Africa, not on its fringes. Each tomb that emerged told the same story. Egypt's rebirth had come not from the north, but from the south. The ancient scribes had written of the Kushite kings with both admiration and resentment. They called them the Black Pharaohs, a phrase that both acknowledged their heritage and separated them from the sanitized image of Egypt that would later dominate Western minds. In the temples of Thebes and Memphis, hieroglyphs still tell of Piye's triumph, his campaign across Egypt to restore Ma'at, the divine order, at a time when the land was divided and chaotic. He didn't invade for gold or glory. He came as a restorer. His victory stela, still standing at Gebel Barkal, describes how he entered Egyptian cities, not as a conqueror, but as a chosen one, purifying temples, reinstating priests, and reminding Egypt of its sacred duty to the gods. In Piye's vision, the Nile Valley was one, a single cultural and spiritual body, not divided by race or border. His faith in unity, became the foundation of the 25th dynasty's legacy. Then came Shabaka, Piye's brother and successor, who turned that spiritual revival into material reality. He rebuilt temples, revived art, and commissioned scholars to preserve the sacred knowledge of the ancients. The famous Shabaka stone preserves an older theological text, the Memphite Theology, in which creation is described as emerging from the spoken word of the god Ptah. Some historians have compared it to the biblical notion of "let there be light," a testament to how Egypt's ancient wisdom flowed through later religions. But Shabaka's greatest legacy was not just what he built, it was what he protected. In an era when Assyria threatened from the east and Libya from the west, he held Egypt together through sheer faith and cultural pride. And then came Taharqa, the name that even the Bible couldn't ignore. His reign was one of magnificence and defiance, a golden age where Egypt's influence stretched deep into Africa and across the Near East. Under Taharqa, the temples of Karnak and Luxor saw new life. He was a warrior, a builder, and a believer. His monuments bore inscriptions of deep devotion to Ammon, the god of creation, whose worship tied Egypt and Nubia together for thousands of years. Even his enemies respected him. The Assyrian annals speak of his armies and wealth with awe. Yet when Western historians later told Egypt's story, they painted him as an intruder, a foreign king, as if Africa could not birth its own greatness. What made the Nubian pharaohs remarkable wasn't just their lineage, it was their vision. They didn't merely imitate Egypt, they redefined it. They restored its heart when centuries of internal strife had nearly destroyed it. Their rule represented the culmination of centuries of cultural exchange between Egypt and Nubia, an exchange of gods, language, art, and bloodlines. To them, Egypt wasn't something to conquer, it was family. The Nile didn't separate them, it united them. But after the fall of Taharqa's dynasty, that unity fractured. When Assyria finally struck with overwhelming force, Egypt splintered again, and Nubia retreated southward. The age of the African pharaohs ended not in disgrace, but in preservation. From their retreat in Meroe, the Nubians would go on to create another empire, one that would thrive for nearly 1,000 more years. Yet even as they built anew, the Western world would later erase them, burying their names beneath racist theories and colonial arrogance. But in truth, the 25th dynasty was not a deviation from Egyptian greatness, it was its resurrection. When Egypt had fallen into decadence, it was Africa that breathed life back into it. That is the story the world doesn't tell, that when the so-called cradle of civilization stumbled, it was its African roots that carried it forward. The Nubian pharaohs of Egypt didn't just rule, they restored, they healed, and they redefined what it meant to be divine. Their monuments still stand, their names still echo, and their truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise again, just as the Nile floods, bringing renewal from the heart of Africa. As centuries faded and empires rose upon their dust, the story of the Nubian pharaohs became a victim of conquest, not just of armies, but of narrative. When Greece and later Rome took Egypt, they inherited not only its monuments, but also the power to tell its story, and like all victors, they rewrote it to serve their image. The African faces that once stood proudly in stone were literally chiseled away, noses broken, lips defaced, features softened to fit a European fantasy of civilization. The conquerors could preserve Egypt's glory, but not if it looked too African. This rewriting wasn't accidental, it was deliberate cultural surgery, because acknowledging that the masters of math, medicine, astronomy, and architecture were black Africans would collapse the false hierarchy that Europe built to justify its later domination. By the time the Greeks settled in Alexandria, Egypt had already been painted as something other, mysterious, exotic, but conveniently detached from its black origins. The temples of Nubia were described as foreign. The dark skin of the southern kings was recorded in Greek chronicles as a curiosity, an anomaly, when it was in fact the source. Yet fragments of truth slipped through even their bias. Herodotus, called the father of history, wrote of the Ethiopians, meaning the Nubians, as the tallest and most beautiful people on earth, unmatched in strength and wisdom, but over time, Western scholarship cherry-picked his praise, keeping the words that fit their myth and discarding the rest. As the Roman Empire expanded its influence, Egypt became a province, a museum for conquerors to plunder. Temples that once celebrated Amun were rededicated to Roman gods. Statues of the pharaohs were repurposed, their features repainted, their inscriptions scraped clean. In Rome's eyes, the Nile's civilization could be admired, but not owned by Africans. That paradox would haunt centuries of scholarship. Even as Renaissance Europe marveled at the pyramids and hieroglyphs, they insisted these wonders couldn't possibly have come from Africa. They invented theories about lost white races, about aliens, about anything that could explain the impossible, that black Africans had built the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. The tragedy is that Egypt's own people had already told us the truth. The tomb paintings, the reliefs, the mummies themselves, they all bear witness to a spectrum of African features, from golden brown to ebony, from the delta to the southern cataracts. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty simply represented the full circle of that heritage. Africa, rising to reclaim its crown. Yet colonial scholars of the 19th century twisted that truth into pseudoscience. They created racial hierarchies and maps that carved Africa into light north and dark south, separating what had always been one cultural continuum. Museums filled with looted artifacts, labeled Egyptian history as Middle Eastern, conveniently removing it from the African narrative. But the earth never lies for long. In the 20th century, archaeology began to restore what history had stolen. Excavations at sites like Jebel Barkal, El Kuru, and Nuri unearthed the tombs of the Kushite kings, Piye, Shabaka, Taharqa, and Tantamani, buried beneath pyramids, smaller but no less regal than those at Giza. Inside, they found not just gold and relics, but evidence of continuity, hieroglyphic inscriptions, royal iconography, and ceremonial items indistinguishable from those in Thebes and Memphis. It was proof that the heart of Egypt's royal tradition had migrated south, not disappeared. The kingdom of Kush had preserved Egypt's soul when Egypt itself had forgotten it. And while the West continued to cling to its myths, a new generation of African and diaspora scholars began to reclaim the truth. They connected the dots between the art, the language, the genetics, and the oral traditions of Nubia. They pointed out what should have been obvious all along, that Egypt was a black civilization born from the same Nile that flowed through Sudan and Ethiopia, shaped by the same sun, and animated by the same spirit that built kingdoms across the continent. The Nubian pharaohs were not an exception, they were the rule returned to form. Today, as the descendants of those who were cut out of history, we stand at a crossroads. Every recovered statue, every restored inscription, every DNA test from ancient remains peels back another layer of deceit. The evidence no longer whispers, it shouts. Africa didn't borrow civilization, it gave it. And when Egypt needed saving, it was Africa that stepped in, wearing the crowns of Piye, Shabaka, and Taharqa, to remind the world where the light began. When Piye's conquests united the Nile, his rule was more than political. It was spiritual restoration. He didn't just march north with armies. He brought back the ancient rites that had fallen silent. The temples that had once echoed with chants to Amu were revived under his decree. Their priests reinstated, their gods honored once more. In his victory stela, carved into stone and still standing today, Piye doesn't boast of slaughter or submission. Instead, he speaks of harmony, piety, and the divine order, Matat, being restored after generations of chaos. This was a ruler who saw himself as the chosen guardian of Egypt's sacred balance, not just its land. His inscriptions describe how he entered Thebes, not as a conqueror, but as a son returning home. Under his successors, the unity between Kush and Egypt blossomed into something powerful. Shabaka, Piye's brother, saw himself as a new menace, the founder of a new age. He commissioned the famous Shabaka stone, a theological text that preserved ancient wisdom from decaying papyrus by carving it into granite. The text describes creation not as conquest, but as divine thought, a cosmic intelligence shaping order out of chaos. That philosophy, which modern scholars see as one of the earliest conceptions of logos or universal reason, was born from African spirituality. Through the Shabaka stone, we glimpse how the African mind understood the universe, not as random matter, but as living consciousness. Then came Taharqa, the greatest of them all, whose reign would stretch across decades, and whose legacy would echo far beyond the sands of Nubia. He was not only a pharaoh, but also a builder, a diplomat, and a warrior. It was under his rule that Egypt experienced a final golden age. Temples rose in Thebes, pyramids gleamed under the Kushite sun, and trade flowed across the Red Sea. Taharqa's image appears everywhere: colossal statues with full African features, broad shoulders, and a gaze that radiates strength and serenity. To his people, he was the embodiment of divine kingship. To his enemies, he was the wall that held back the chaos of foreign invasion. But greatness always draws envy. When the Assyrians turned their eyes toward Egypt, they saw in Taharqa not just a rival but a symbol, a black king commanding one of the richest lands on earth. Their chroniclers wrote about him with a mix of fear and fascination. Even in defeat, Taharqa's legend grew. His armies fought with valor against overwhelming odds, his fortresses holding back the storm until they could no longer resist the tide of empire. Yet even when he was forced to retreat south to Nubia, he didn't fall. He regrouped, rebuilt, and passed the torch to his successors. The world would later call this retreat an end. But for the Nubians, it was preservation. They returned to their homeland, carrying Egypt's gods, rituals, and architecture with them. The pyramids of Nuri and El Karu were not acts of nostalgia, they were declarations. Each one was a statement that Africa's spiritual and political light didn't extinguish with foreign conquest. It simply returned to its source. The Nile's southern kingdom became the last defender of ancient Egyptian tradition, long after Egypt itself had succumbed to foreign rule. And while the world turned its gaze elsewhere, the Kushite kings and queens continued to reign, not in shadow, but in dignity. They built temples to Amun that rivaled those of Karnak. They traded with Arabia, India, and even the Mediterranean, proving that the heart of African civilization never stopped beating. What Europe would later call lost kingdoms were never lost at all. They were deliberately ignored. Centuries later, when archaeologists first stumbled upon the pyramids of Sudan, they were shocked to find dozens upon dozens of them, smaller than Giza's, but no less magnificent. Many were built by queens, kandakes, who ruled as sovereigns, commanded armies, and negotiated peace. They bore royal titles, wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and presided over rituals that dated back to the Old Kingdom. These women were not anomalies. They were heirs to a royal lineage that had begun millennia before on the banks of the Nile. Every carving, every inscription, every relic from that era speaks with quiet power. They tell us that Africa's history didn't begin with slavery, and it didn't end with colonialism. It was never waiting to be discovered. It was always there, ruling, building, thinking, writing, believing. The African pharaohs of Egypt were not an exception to history. They were history. The rest of the world simply chose not to look. When modern historians finally began to examine the artifacts left by the Nubian pharaohs, something remarkable happened. The narrative of Egypt began to shift. Excavations at Jebel Barkal, Napata, and Meroe revealed evidence of a thriving civilization that had been far more than a footnote to Egypt's story. These sites were filled with temples dedicated to Amun, sandstone carvings of kings and queens in full regalia, and inscriptions that blended Egyptian hieroglyphs with Meroitic script, an African language still being deciphered today. What archaeologists found was not a kingdom copying Egypt, but one continuing it, a successor state that held on to ancient traditions when Egypt itself had lost them. The monuments of Kush stood as living proof that civilization didn't flow north from Greece, as textbooks long claimed, but south from Africa's heart. Yet even as this evidence mounted, many Western scholars resisted the implications. To accept that Egypt, the foundation of so much Western art, science, and philosophy, was ruled by black Africans, was to unravel centuries of racial propaganda. Colonial-era historians, working under European empires, built entire careers on the idea that greatness was a European trait, and that Africa contributed little but labor. When Nubian statues appeared with unmistakably African features, broad noses, coiled hair, dark stone chosen deliberately to represent melanin-rich skin, they were described as symbolic, stylized, or unusual. The idea that they were accurate portraits of real African rulers was ignored. Some early archaeologists even damaged or removed features from statues to make them appear more classical. History wasn't just misinterpreted, it was vandalized. Despite this, the truth continued to rise from the sands. In Sudan, dozens of royal pyramids have been uncovered, outnumbering those of Egypt several times over. Inside, wall paintings and inscriptions show not slaves or foreigners, but proud African nobility performing royal ceremonies. They show Queen Amenishaketo, covered in gold jewelry, and King Nestasin recording his victories. They show processions of priests, armies, and sacred bulls, the same symbols that had once decorated the temples of Thebes. These discoveries prove that the spiritual and political power of Egypt didn't die with the new kingdom. It migrated south, where it lived for another 1,000 years under black rule. In the Grand Museum narratives of the 19th and 20th centuries, this continuity was erased to maintain a racial hierarchy of civilization. Egypt was described as Mediterranean, or Semitic, and Kush was reduced to a side note. But if you trace the art, the language, the religious iconography, and even the genetic record, it becomes undeniable. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, Piye, Shabaka, Shibitku, Taharqa, and Tenutamani, were African kings ruling a reunified Nile valley. They didn't invade as foreigners, they reclaimed a heritage that was theirs by right. Modern technology now supports what ancient chroniclers once wrote. DNA analysis of royal mummies, cranial measurements of statues, and pigment residue on temple walls all point towards sub-Saharan features. In fact, classical Greek historians like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus already described the Egyptians as melanchrous, meaning dark-skinned and wool-haired. These were observations made thousands of years ago, but dismissed in modern times because they didn't fit the colonial narrative. The truth was always there, buried under layers of denial, and perhaps most telling of all are the Nubian pyramids themselves, not built to imitate, but to innovate. Their steep angles and clustered formations suggest a spiritual geometry distinct from Giza's grand symmetry. These were not monuments to ego, but portals to eternity. Each pyramid was built above a chapel, where offerings were made to the deceased, and murals inside depict journeys to the afterlife, guided by African gods, whose names and faces had evolved from the Egyptian pantheon. In these chambers, the lines between Egypt and Kush disappear. There is no separation between Egyptian and African, because to the people who built them, they were one and the same. The more we learn about these African pharaohs, the more the old myths collapse. The myth that Africa had no writing, even though Meroitic script still awaits full translation. The myth that Africa needed foreign influence to achieve greatness, even though Kushite engineering and artistry rivaled any in the ancient world. The myth that civilization moved only northward, when the archaeological record proves that culture, religion, and power flowed both ways along the Nile. The evidence is overwhelming. The African pharaohs of Egypt didn't just exist, they redefined what empire meant. They were not invaders from outside the continent,
but the rightful heirs of a lineage that began at the dawn of civilization itself.
The story of the African pharaohs isn't a story of rebellion or imitation. It's a story of restoration. When King Piye of Kush first set eyes on the chaos-consuming Egypt, he didn't see a foreign land to conquer. He saw an ancestral home to heal. His inscriptions, preserved on steels carved over 2,700 years ago, don't read like the words of a warlord, but like the vows of a guardian. "I am the son of Amun," he wrote, "sent to restore order where disorder reigns." And he did. He marched north from Napata with precision and restraint, uniting warring Egyptian princes under one crown, without desecrating their temples or enslaving their people. He washed himself in the Nile as part of an ancient purification rite, and declared that he would rule Egypt as the old pharaohs did, through Ma'at, the divine balance of truth and justice. His vision wasn't to replace Egypt, but to remind it of itself. That vision was carried forward by his descendants. King Shabaka preserved sacred texts that were already crumbling in Egyptian memory, including the Memphite Theology, one of the oldest philosophical writings in the world. In it, the god Pata speaks creation into existence, a theology that predates and parallels later religious traditions. Without Shabaka's intervention, that wisdom might have vanished forever. His brother Taharqa took that same divine mission and extended it beyond the Nile. He built massive temples, redug canals, and restored monuments that had fallen into ruin. Under his reign, Egypt and Kush together experienced a golden age of prosperity, one that radiated influence into the Near East and the Mediterranean. Even the Bible mentions Taharqa, describing him as a mighty ruler who opposed the Assyrians when they threatened Jerusalem, a moment when an African king stood between an empire and destruction. But greatness always challenges power, and the Assyrians eventually invaded Egypt. Though they defeated the Kushites militarily, they could never erase the spiritual legacy they left behind. The temples they built still stand, the art they revived still glows, and the names of their kings, Piye, Shabaka, Shibitku, Taharqa, Tanutamani, still echo in stone. After retreating back to Nubia, the dynasty continued to rule in splendor from Napata, and later Meroe for centuries more, long after Egypt itself had fallen under foreign rule. Yet, as time passed and European explorers began rewriting history through their own lenses, these kings were recast as foreign intruders, dark invaders, or simply ignored altogether. Their achievements were split from Egypt's legacy to maintain the illusion that civilization flowed from lighter to darker skin. Museums displayed the artifacts, but hid the identity of the hands that made them. Textbooks labeled them Ethiopian or Nubian in vague, disconnected ways, as if to keep blacks separate from Egyptian. It was a silent theft of credit, one that shaped centuries of misunderstanding. Today, the sands are giving up their secrets again. Satellite imaging has uncovered hundreds of buried pyramids in Sudan, and archaeologists are racing to excavate them before erosion and looting destroy what's left. Each discovery rewrites another page of history, showing us that Africa didn't just give the world gold, music, and culture. It gave civilization itself. From hieroglyphs to geometry, medicine to theology, the roots of human advancement are braided deep into African soil. When we tell the story of Egypt without acknowledging its African core, we're not just distorting the past, we're denying the world its true origins. Egypt was never isolated from Africa. It was Africa. Its kings, priests, and builders were shaped by the same sun, carved from the same earth, and driven by the same ancestral spirit that birthed kingdoms all across the continent. The Nubian pharaohs didn't Africanize Egypt, they revealed the Africa that was always there. And that's the truth the world is still learning to face. The glory of Egypt, its art, its science, its monuments, is not the story of a borrowed genius, but of a civilization built by African minds in African hands. Every pyramid, every temple, every hieroglyph carved in stone is a testimony not just to human brilliance, but to black brilliance. Because the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, the kings of Kush, the rulers of Napata and Meroe, They weren't anomalies. They were Africa remembering itself. The deeper we look into the 25th dynasty, the more it becomes clear that these African pharaohs were not merely rulers. They were architects of legacy, determined to merge faith, politics, and identity into a single force that would outlast empires. Taharqa, often remembered as the most powerful of them all, left behind temples and carvings that rival anything from earlier dynasties. His image, broad-nosed, full-lipped, regal, and unmistakably African, still gazes from the sandstone walls of Kawa and Gebel Barkal. He didn't just build monuments for glory. He built them as bridges between the divine and his people. In his inscriptions, he speaks of restoring balance to the world through service to Amun, the great god whose worship had begun centuries before Egypt even existed as a united kingdom. Taharqa saw himself as chosen, not by conquest, but by destiny, a custodian of an eternal African flame that no foreign empire could extinguish. Under his leadership, Egypt experienced a rebirth. Trade routes reopened, agriculture flourished, and a wave of artistic revival swept through temples along the Nile. Sculptors reintroduced the old styles, reviving the spiritual realism of early dynasties, portraying gods and kings not as distant figures but as beings connected to their people. The pyramids of Nuri, where Taharqa and his successors were buried, stand as living evidence of this revival. They are smaller than Giza's colossal pyramids, but every bit as sacred, symbolizing not decline but renewal, a return to the heart of Africa's spiritual and royal traditions. But while Taharqa's Egypt was flourishing, the world around it was shifting. The Assyrians, ruthless and expansionist, sought control of every kingdom from the Tigris to the Nile. When they came for Egypt, Taharqa stood as the last barrier between them and total domination of North Africa. The battles were brutal, but they were not the story of defeat they are often made out to be. Even in retreat, Taharqa's name carried power. Even his enemies recorded his courage, and long after his armies withdrew, his legend remained a thorn in the pride of those who sought to erase his reign. After Taharqa's death, his nephew Tanudamani attempted to reclaim the north, launching campaigns that terrified the Assyrians. But the foreign powers eventually pushed the Kushites back to their southern capital of Napata. Yet even in retreat, these kings did not fade. They transformed. From Napata to Merowe, they built a new African heartland, blending Egyptian tradition with indigenous innovation. Their pyramids dotted the Sudanese desert. Their script evolved into Meroitic, one of the world's earliest alphabets, developed independently on African soil. Ironworks, artistry, and education thrived there for centuries, long after Egypt had fallen under Greek and Roman control. These facts rewrite the narrative of lost Africa. The 25th dynasty didn't mark the end of Egypt's greatness. It marked the start of a long continuum of African genius that Europe simply chose not to remember. The Greek historians who visited later saw remnants of that Kushite legacy, but misunderstood its roots, describing it through their own lenses. By the time Western scholarship rediscovered Egypt thousands of years later, the faces of its kings had been whitewashed, their features softened, their origins disguised under the myth of a Mediterranean civilization. But history has a way of resurfacing. Every archaeological discovery, every genetic study, every temple wall uncovered beneath the desert sands screams the same truth. The Nile Valley was black. The priests, the builders, the astronomers, the kings, they were all African. The 25th dynasty was not an anomaly in a foreign empire. It was the natural continuation of a legacy that began in the south and moved north. The so-called Black Pharaohs weren't conquerors of Egypt. They were its sons returning home. And that's what the world still struggles to accept. Because to admit that Africa restored Egypt, that it preserved its culture, defended its gods, and revitalized its institutions, is to admit that Africa was never behind. That the continent didn't need saving, didn't need civilizing. It taught civilization. It sustained it. It was and remains the mother of humanity's light. When we trace the legacy of these African pharaohs beyond the borders of Egypt, we find something even more powerful, a cultural ripple that reached across the continent and beyond. The influence of Kushite Egypt did not vanish when the dynasty ended. It evolved into a network of African knowledge, spirituality, and artistry that continued to shape kingdoms from the Sahel to the Horn. The city of Meroe became the new beacon of this renaissance. Its black stone pyramids, rising like dark flames against the desert sky, carried inscriptions written in a unique script no outsider could decipher for centuries. This was the Meroitic language, born from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but transformed into something entirely African, a visual declaration of independence from foreign influence. The people of Meroe mastered ironworking long before much of the world understood its potential, turning their city into the metallurgical heart of ancient Africa. Their queens, known as kandakes, ruled alongside kings, or sometimes over them entirely, fierce women like a Manitor and a Manishakato, who commanded armies and built temples of their own. The world likes to pretend that Africa's story after Egypt was silence. In truth, it was symphony. The Kushite legacy echoed across generations. Ethiopian chronicles, for example, describe their emperors as descendants of ancient Nile royalty. The Ark of the Covenant itself, according to Ethiopian tradition, rests in the city of Axum, brought there by a bloodline that traced back to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a queen whose homeland many scholars now associate with the Kushite world. From the Upper Nile to the highlands of Abyssinia, echoes of Egypt's gods, architecture, and philosophy continued to live on. Temples were rededicated to new deities, hieroglyphic principles reimagined in African art, and pyramidal structures reappeared in sacred forms across Nubia and beyond. Meanwhile, far away in the deserts of Sudan, archaeologists uncover evidence of thriving cities that traded with India, Greece, and Rome. African merchants from Meroe shipped ivory, gold, incense, and exotic animals up the Nile and across the Red Sea. They were not isolated, they were central, the middle link in a global economy that predated European exploration by millennia. These were the descendants of the African pharaohs, inheritors of a world built on discipline, science, and spiritual order. Their gods were not forgotten either. Amun, Isis, Horus, and others continued to be worshipped in new forms, their images adapted, but their essence untouched. Yet, as the centuries passed, Western historians began to rewrite these connections. They severed Egypt from its African roots and placed it in a false Middle Eastern bubble, erasing the continuity between Kush Egypt and the rest of the continent. They called the African pharaohs Nubian invaders, as though they had come from some alien planet, instead of from the very river that gave Egypt life. They ignored the archaeological layers that showed steady migration and cultural exchange between Upper Egypt and Nubia, long before any European kingdom even existed. The division between Black Africa and Egypt wasn't natural, it was constructed, designed to maintain a racial hierarchy, even in the pages of history. Today, that barrier is crumbling. DNA testing, from mummified remains, skeletal analyses, and even art restoration, reveal what many already knew in their bones. The features of Egypt's rulers, workers, and priests were African. Dark skin tones, broad noses, coiled hair, these are not modern projections, but ancient realities. The frescoes of Thebes, the tombs of the nobles, the statues of Karnak and Luxor, all depict faces that mirror those of the Nile's southern people. The African pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, then, are not an exception, but a reminder that blackness is not a footnote in civilization's story. It is the story that Africa was not the student of Egypt, but its heart, that when the Nile flowed with wisdom, it flowed from the south, and perhaps most importantly, that every time the world tried to forget, Africa found a way to remember. The erasure of Africa's pharaohs didn't happen overnight. It was a slow rewriting, a quiet theft, that began the moment Western explorers laid eyes on the ruins of Egypt. Napoleon's scholars, who documented every temple and tomb during the French campaign in the late 1700s, saw evidence that contradicted their worldview. The statues bore African features. The wall paintings showed brown and black-skinned figures of nobility, artisans, and priests. The hieroglyphs spoke of gods with southern origins, but instead of acknowledging what they found, they reinterpreted it. They recolored the art, they redrew the faces, and they called the images symbolic rather than literal. They argued that Egypt was too advanced to have been built by black people. That was the start of a lie that would shape global education for centuries. Textbooks began to describe Egypt as Mediterranean, divorcing it from the rest of Africa. Museum curators labeled artifacts with vague terms like Near Eastern or North African, anything but black. It was more than a mistake, it was an agenda. Because to admit that Africans once ruled one of the world's greatest empires would destroy the very foundation of white supremacy. By the 19th century, Egyptology had become a playground for European colonial powers. The British, the French, and the Germans competed not just for artifacts, but for ownership of Egypt's story. They looted mummies, tore down temples, and filled their museums with African relics, then rewrote the descriptions beneath them. The faces of kings like Taharqa and Shabaka were cast in stone for all to see, yet described as foreign conquerors. It was a linguistic trick. They called them foreign to imply they didn't belong in Egypt, as though Nubia and Egypt weren't two sides of the same Nile. But history doesn't lie forever. Over the past few decades, archaeologists and African scholars have been piecing the truth back together. Inscriptions on temple walls show not invaders, but restorers, pharaohs who rebuilt what earlier dynasties had let crumble. The Nubian kings didn't sack Egypt, they revived it. They repaired temples, reinstated laws, restored the priesthood of Amun, and reignited the spiritual flame of Maat, balance and justice. They didn't come to destroy Egypt's legacy, they came to preserve it. But Europe couldn't accept that. They needed Egypt to be separate from Africa, to keep civilization white and Africa primitive. That's why even today, in classrooms and documentaries, the faces of Egypt are lightened, the noses slimmed, the hair straightened. They tell us civilization flowed north, when in truth, it always flowed south, from the heart of Africa, outward. The Nile carried not only water, but wisdom. And the 25th dynasty proved that when Africa unites, it doesn't just survive, it leads. The empire they built stretched from the Mediterranean to the Ethiopian highlands. It was diverse, multilingual, and advanced in science, trade, and art. For nearly 100 years, these African pharaohs governed with discipline and pride, overseeing one of the last golden ages before the Persian conquest. Their legacy reminds us that power and beauty did not come from Greece or Rome first. Those nations borrowed from Africa. Even the concept of divine kingship, the very idea that rulers were godlike figures, was an African invention. The Kushite pharaohs embodied that fully. They wore the double crown, not as conquerors, but as unifiers of two lands, two cultures, one spirit. The temples they left behind in Gebel Barkal and Napata still bear inscriptions of victory and peace, proof that they led through reverence, not oppression. And when we restore their story, we restore something greater than history. We restore balance, because to know the African pharaohs is to understand that black civilization is not a myth, not a mystery, and not a reaction to colonization. It is the foundation upon which the world still stands. And so when you hear them say the Egyptians weren't black, remember who wrote those books, remember who owned those museums, and remember who stood on the Nile's banks thousands of years ago, watching the sunrise over pyramids their ancestors built, speaking a language that carried the heartbeat of Africa. Those were the first keepers of time, the architects of eternity, and the rulers of the world's first great empire, African to the core. By now, the truth should feel less like a revelation and more like recognition, a memory awakening from centuries of silence. The African pharaohs of Egypt weren't an exception to history. They were history. The problem wasn't that their story was too hard to find. It's that people in power made sure it stayed buried. When European scholars and colonizers carved their version of civilization, they drew a border between Egypt and the rest of Africa, because acknowledging Africa as the mother of civilization would dismantle everything they stood on. You can trace this rewriting of history across generations of textbooks, museums, and films, where Egypt becomes Middle Eastern, where the skin tones of its rulers fade to beige, and where the faces of gods, warriors, and scholars are subtly reimagined to fit a Western lens. But the walls of the temples never lied. The paint that remains, even after millennia of decay, still shows brown and black tones. The carvings still display broad features, coiled hair, and full lips. The unmistakable imprint of African identity. These aren't artistic coincidences. They're records of a civilization that knew exactly who it was. The 25th dynasty, led by the Kushite Pharaohs, was not a minor footnote. It was one of Egypt's greatest revivals. Pharaoh Piye brought back order after chaos, restoring the power of the temple and enforcing justice across both Nubia and Egypt. Pharaoh Shabaka preserved ancient wisdom by compiling the Memphite Theology, a philosophical text that predates Greek thought by centuries. Pharaoh Taharqa, remembered by both Egyptian and biblical records, defended his people against Assyrian invasions, and was described by historians as a powerful righteous king, whose rule extended as far as Jerusalem. These were not men of myth, they were real, recorded and revered by those who lived under them. Yet for centuries, their names were downplayed or dismissed as interlopers. Western Egyptologists use that word again and again, as if these men had no right to sit on Egypt's throne, as if the Nile itself didn't flow from their homeland. But that's the irony. Without Nubia, there is no Egypt. The stone, the gold, the culture, the language, all flowed northward. The DNA of Egypt is African, not foreign. And yet, when black scholars began reasserting these truths in the 20th century, they were mocked. European historians called Afrocentrism revisionist. They claimed it was emotion, not evidence. But time has a way of exposing liars. Modern archaeology, DNA studies, and linguistic evidence now confirm what African griots and oral traditions preserved all along, that the bloodlines of Nubia and Egypt were one and the same. The same culture that raised the pyramids also built temples deep in Sudan. The same gods, Amun, Isis, Osiris, were worshipped in both lands. The idea that Egypt turned white or became Arab only came much later, through invasion and empire. The original Egypt was as African as the Congo or Ethiopia, rooted in the land, powered by the sun, and rich in spirit. If you look at the temples of Napata and Meroe, you'll see the continuation of Egypt's story, not its imitation. When the 25th dynasty fell, Kush didn't die, it thrived, building its own pyramids, smaller but more numerous, and sustaining a unique African form of kingship that lasted for another 1,000 years. Those pyramids still stand today, quiet and unbothered by the lies told about them. Few tourists visit them, few documentaries mention them, but they are there, defying erasure. Every stone whispers the same truth, that Africa's greatness doesn't begin with slavery. It begins with civilization. It begins with power, order, beauty, and a vision of eternity that stretched across deserts and rivers. The time has come to reclaim that truth, not as a story for scholars, but as a story for everyone, because the world still benefits from Egypt's light, even while denying where that light came from. The African pharaohs didn't need to be remembered as saviors. They were builders, thinkers, and dreamers, who defined what human greatness could be. Their names deserve to be spoken with reverence again, not in whispers, but in pride. The story of the African pharaohs isn't just about restoring faces to statues. It's about restoring balance to truth. For centuries, history has been told like a pyramid flipped upside down, its foundation buried while the smallest, most convenient parts were placed on display. But truth has weight, and no matter how long it's buried, it finds its way to the surface. The African pharaohs of Egypt, Piye, Shabaka, Shibiku, Taharqa, and Tantamani, were not pretenders to a foreign throne. They were the blood of the Nile made flesh. They were Africans ruling in Africa. Their reign wasn't an invasion, it was a homecoming. The 25th dynasty was a moment when the two lands of Egypt and Kush, long divided by politics and pride, remembered they were one civilization, one river, one heartbeat. Their rule marked not decline, but restoration. They didn't bring war and destruction, they brought revival. Temples were rebuilt, trade routes reopened, scholars and scribes flourished again. In their time, Egypt was not a relic, it was reborn. And that's the part they don't want you to know. Because if you knew that black men once ruled the greatest empire of the ancient world, not as slaves or servants, but as gods and kings, then the lie collapses. The lie that Africa was only a follower, never a leader. The lie that civilization came from the north, and not from the beating heart of the south. The lie that the story of humanity starts in Greece or Rome, instead of the banks of the Nile. Every erasure, every broken nose, every whitewashed painting was meant to make you forget that you come from architects, astronomers, and philosophers, people who measured the stars long before Europe found its bearings. When the 25th dynasty was defeated by the Assyrians, their cities may have fallen, but their culture didn't. Nubia endured, passing its legacy down to kingdoms like Meroe, Axum, and Makuria, each carrying fragments of Egypt's light further into Africa's interior. Even after the sands buried their temples, the knowledge they left behind, medicine, geometry, theology, continued to shape the world that followed. So when you stand before the pyramids, remember those aren't just tombs, they are mirrors. They reflect who we were before the lies began. They remind us that power and intellect, art and divinity, once wore skin like ours. Egypt was African, not because it sat on the continent, but because it was born from Africa's mind. That truth doesn't need approval, it only needs voice. And now, you are that voice. Imagine if schools taught this without hesitation. If museums placed Nubia and Egypt side by side. If films dared to show Pharaoh Taharqa as the powerful dark-skinned king he was. The world would look at Africa differently. Black children would see themselves not at the end of history, but at its dawn. Because that's the truth. You are not descended from shadows. You are descended from the builders of light. Let this be the closing of their story, and the beginning of yours. The moment we stop asking for validation, and start teaching what we've always known. The African pharaohs were real. Their greatness undeniable. Their legacy eternal. They do not need discovery, they demand remembrance. And if the world still chooses to look away, then it's time to build new pyramids, not of stone, but of truth, towering high enough that even the blind cannot ignore them. Because Egypt was black, Africa was the cradle, and the world was built on its shoulders. And the sooner we say it with pride, the sooner history comes home.